This orchard is a graphic example of the effect of radiant heat from a fire. Now the reality is nothing actually burnt in this orchard, but across the road was bushland and the heat of that was extreme. The rows of fruit trees closest to the bushland are more devastated than those further away. So it's when we look at trees that are reshooting that we can make assessments on whether they're going to be viable or not. So if there was dead grass at the base of the tree and it burnt, you need to investigate to see whether the tree's being ring-barked by the heat at the base. How you do that is you get a knife and you cut into the trunk. We're looking at the cambium layer. This is the layer just below the brown bark. Now this cambium is part of the tree's circulatory system, and if it's healthy and alive it's green, and if it's dead it's brown. Now a tree can survive if it's got 80% dead and 20% green, but when we're talking about a tree that's a fruiting tree that's going to carry a load and it's going to put a stress on it, isn't going to fruit very well and it may fail down the track. So if you haven't got green cambium around a fruiting tree, it may pay to remove the tree and start from scratch. Now in this case, where it's radiant heat, we can see there's actually discoloration on the trunk, showing where the trunk actually got dieback. But most of the trunk, when we cut into it, remains green. So we know that the tree is still functioning. Sometimes where you've got that dieback on the trunk, where the radiant heat affected the tree, the bark will even split. Now here we can see that smaller branches were killed by the heat, but the central trunk of the tree remains viable. Now we would make a judgment whether we remove those smaller branches and let the tree try and come back. But when it's a fruiting tree, we've got to understand that when the tree has crops on it in years to come, that's going to put extra stress on the tree. So it may or may not be worth keeping. It may be better to be brutal and get rid of the tree and start from scratch. Now the other thing that can happen when a tree is burnt is you can get suckers appear. Now if a tree is growing on its own roots, such as a fig tree, often it's worth cutting the tree off near the ground and letting it reshoot. Now the same with a vine. Vines are generally grown on their own roots, and so if they have been burnt, you're better to cut the trunk off and let it reshoot from the base. Now it's going to take several years before that tree is able to crop again, but you've got the energy of that root system of an established plant feeding into new growth, and that tree will come good. Now when it's a grafted tree, which is in the case of most other deciduous fruit trees, if you see an occasional sucker from the base, you need to take that off. Now if the trunk itself has died and there's a couple of suckers, you could even cut the main plant off, train to one sucker and regraft it to the cultivar that you want. However, if you've got lots of suckers coming from the base, that's going to be a nightmare to manage over time, and you're actually better to rip them all out and start again. So if you've got a tree that's got healthy cambium, but there are some branches that have died back, you can simply remove them. Make sure they're dead first though, and the way you do that is simply to use your fingernail and scratch the bark. If it's brown underneath, it's dead, but if it's green, it's still alive. So if we were to cut these dead branches off, next summer, the tree that used to have canopy which gave it protection could be exposed to sunburn along the trunk. So what you could do to counteract that is paint it with some kaolin clay or even some white water-based house paint. That would protect the trunk while the canopy regrows.